CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Andrew Wilson.
And I'm Juliette Mann. Our top stories. Ukraine's President Zelensky said his country can survive the attacks by Russia, but warns the conflict will have a global impact.
The streets of Kiev are quiet as the capital remains under curfew. Ukrainian forces claim they've retaken a key suburb.
As recovery teams search the site of a plane crash in southern China, questions continue to be asked over why it came down so quickly.
Russia's jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny has sentence extended by 9 years after being found guilty of fraud and contempt of court.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his country is on the brink of surviving its war with Russia.
But in a video link addressed to the Italian Parliament, he also warned of increasing global instability and food shortages because of the war. Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi has backed Ukraine's request to join the European Union.
Zelensky said he'd spoken to Pope Francis and had asked the Vatican to play a mediating role. And he said more help was needed to defeat Russia's military campaign. And our correspondent Linda Kennedy is in Brussels for us. So, Linda, tell us a bit more about Zelensky's address.
It was an uncompromising speech to the Italian parliamentarians. It lasted 12 minutes and he got a standing ovation at the end of it. And like many of these speeches to national assemblies, it was tailored to the audience. He said that Ukraine had helped Italy at the very beginning of the pandemic, when of course it was one of the countries that was worst hit, especially in the north of the nation. He was saying Ukraine had sent doctors, so he was quite consciously reminding them of that. But in addition to that, he was talking about the horrendous conditions on the ground in Ukraine. He was saying that behaviour from Russian invaders was similar to behaviour that had been seen from the Nazis. He called for the world to do more pressure, more sanctions. Let's have a listen to an excerpt from that speech.
Now is the time to do everything possible to secure peace, so that the war that had been prepared for a long time by Russia, by one person for tens of years. They earned enormous money by exporting oil and gas and used that money to prepare a war not only against Ukraine, their goal is Europe. They want to have an enormous influence on your lives, control over your politics and ruin your values, not only ours. Democracy, human rights, equality, freedom, the same values that we have.
You heard in that speech him talking about the enormous amounts of money that Russia makes from oil and gas, and that has been the focus so much here in Brussels of sanctions, whether or not the EU can apply more sanctions specifically targeting Russian energy. And if President Zelensky is hopeful that EU members, of which of course Italy is one, are likely to announce that kind of pressure, those kind of sanctions this week, in a week of a lot of diplomatic summits, then he is likely to be disappointed. Early indications of what's likely to lie ahead came yesterday from the EU foreign ministers meeting. They basically look at what might go on the agenda for the European Council meeting later in the week. That's the meeting of all the EU leaders, and they disagreed on any way ahead in terms of immediate sanctions on Russian fossil fuels by EU nations. There's just too much division. You have Baltic nations and Poland calling for strong sanctions on oil and gas, and then you have Germany and Hungary who are just saying we're too reliant on those as a bloc for those to really seriously be on the table.
And on top of Zelensky wanting more pressure, or more economic pressure on Russia, they're also very keen to join the European Union. And Italy's giving its backing to Ukraine, hasn't it?
It has, and it comes at the same time as a push from a lot of the eastern countries in the European Union, countries like Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Poland. And they are saying that on the European Council agenda later in the week, there would like to be a pledge for a European perspective for Ukraine, for a move towards its candidacy. So the support from Italy comes on top of that. Let's have a listen to what Prime Minister Mario Draghi had to say.
Since the beginning of the war, Italy has admired the courage, the determination and patriotism of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian citizens. You said that your people have become your army. The arrogance of the Russian government has collided with the dignity of the Ukrainian people, who have managed to curb Moscow's expansionist aims and impose a huge cost on the invading army. The resistance of Mariupol, Kharkiv, Odessa and all the places in which President Putin's ferocity is being brought down is heroic.
The problem with Italy's statement that they would support Ukraine's membership of the European Union and the push from the eastern countries of the EU towards a faster track for Ukraine to join is that it's just really not going to work. I mean, all of this was discussed at the last meeting of European leaders at Versailles just 2 weeks ago. And President Macron of France said, well, you can't start negotiations with a country that is at war. They feel, the European leaders, that they're already, to some degree, hastening the application by Ukraine by having an opinion from the European Commission as to whether or not it's even a possibility. The normal run of things is that you have to get candidacy, then there has to be unanimity from all of the members before membership negotiations can start. And that whole thing generally takes about 10 years, a little bit faster in the case of Sweden or Finland. So what we heard there from Mario Draghi was admiration, but it's not being translated into the kind of action that President Zelensky was so loudly calling for in that video link address.
Linda Kennedy in Brussels, thank you very much for that update.
Reports from Kiev suggest that Ukrainian forces have retaken a key suburb of the capital. And there's more news on Russian troop casualties as well. Let's cross to Michael Voss, who's in Lviv for us. Michael, good to see you. It feels like there's something of a lull, although we do know there's fierce fighting going on around some of Ukraine's cities. What have you heard?
Well, certainly there is fierce fighting to the north of the capital, Kiev. As you say, the Ukrainians have retaken a city called Makariv to the northwest, a suburb to the northwest of the capital. The Russians had moved in, the Ukrainians managed to get them out, and now they're saying that so far they have managed to withstand a Russian counteroffensive. Now, Western security analysts say that this is a really important town, and that if the Ukrainians can hold it, if the Russians fail to retake it, it's going to make their offensive to try and surround the capital that much more difficult. But to the northeast of the capital, there's another town called Borispil, where the mayor has told everybody they have to get out. It's time to evacuate because it looks as if a Russian offensive is heading their way. Other news around the country, fierce fighting and shelling around the second city, Kharkiv. And in Mariupol, that strategic port town in the south, the fighting goes on. It hasn't fallen to the Russians, despite the fact that troops have entered the city. The Ukrainians are still resisting. One other bit of news, the Ukrainians say that 10 hospitals have been destroyed in bombing, while the World Health Organization says it has confirmed 62 separate attacks on healthcare facilities. Andrew.
Michael, some news from a Russian website about numbers of Russian casualties, but I gather the figures have been disputed.
Yes, that's right. This was a pro-Kremlin newspaper, and on its website, it published what it says was a Ministry of Defense release about casualties, saying that Russia had suffered almost 10,000 fatalities in this war so far, and another 15,000 people were injured. They took it down very quickly, and then subsequently they've issued a statement saying, no, this wasn't true, that they were hacked and that this wasn't the case. The Ukrainians have issued a statement saying they've killed 15,000 Russian troops. I think the trouble in the fog of war is you're never going to know true casualty figures. One side will exaggerate, one side will underestimate. But were this figure of 10,000 Russian military killed so far in the first 3.5 weeks of this conflict, that would be a very high figure.
Indeed it would. Michael, thanks very much indeed. Michael Voss there in Lviv for us.
Germany says Ukraine will eventually need a Marshall Plan to finance reconstruction, like the one in Germany after World War II. How far would such a plan go, and who foots the bill? Oleg Ustenko is an economic advisor to President Zelensky, and he joins us now from Ukraine. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thanks for coming on. Do you think that Ukraine needs a Marshall Plan?
Oh, yes, for sure. Look, the country is destroyed in many senses. We already lost, cities. Cities are destroyed. For example, city of Mariupol, destroyed by 95%, so almost nothing left out of that city. Kharkov is the largest city in Ukraine, or one of the largest cities in Ukraine, destroyed also. Look, we already lost several $100 billion in our assets, and we are talking about the economy where GDP last year was a historical maximum of $200 billion. So we are talking now about, at least 2 times more in destroyed assets. So definitely, I'm not even talking about, civilians who were killed. I'm not talking about, children who were killed. I'm not talking about women who were raped by Russian soldiers. Yes, of course, the economy has to be rebuilt. And of course, it's a question where we are going to have this money for rebuilding the Ukrainian economy, this kind of Marshall Plan, which should be applicable for Ukraine. In our view in Kiev, we do believe that we can use money which were frozen from the Central Bank of Russia. And we are talking here about somewhere close to $300 billion which are frozen. We also believe that another source of this fund should be all arrested property of Russian oligarchs and inner cycle of Putin. So also money should be coming to this fund, and of course, international support should also go to this fund. What should be done in Ukraine? We need to rebuild infrastructure, which is totally destroyed now, almost all over the city because of the Russian bombing, air bombing attacks, which we experience, hundreds times a day. For example, in the city of Kharkov today, Russians were bombing the city almost 100 times. One city, almost 100 times, where experienced bombing from the Russian planes and from the Russian army. So the sirens are all over the country, and we are talking about the countries of the size of France. So the sirens of air attacks is coming, alarming all our population. It's coming in all regions of Ukraine. So basically, you can understand the damage we have in the country.
Huge damage in the country. I mean, you're tossing it up there to $300 billion that you think should be paid by oligarchs' frozen assets, their portfolios, and of course some foreign aid as well. I mean, it's really hard to even begin to work out the economic cost on top of the human cost you mentioned. But I also want to talk to you about this potential food security crisis that might be looming. After all, the price of wheat shot up immediately after a Russia attack, and now Ukraine's struggling to get its wheat out. So how has the Russian invasion created that food security crisis, not just in Ukraine, but beyond?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very good question. Look, Ukraine is an important player on the international market, on the international food market. We are among top 5 producers of wheat. We are controlling 50% of sunflower oil. Internationally, we are supplying somewhere around 15% of different types of grain to international market. Obviously, for us, it's extremely important in terms of our own security. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's extremely important for the world, for the international community, because our soaring campaign is usually starts during the first week of March and should be ended during the 3rd week of April. This is a must. Yes, we can move a little bit, but not more than 1 week. So basically, based on this, it's really necessary to stop the war as soon as possible. even if you think only in terms of international food security. However, you can observe already negative consequences on the international market. Prices for agro commodities went up very rapidly, and I assume that if the war is not stopped, then this process will continue. In terms of the global security, also please understand that in consumer baskets in different countries, the share of food products are different. For example, in our case in Ukraine, it's around 40%, but in Poland it's 33%. In France, it's around 10%, but you can easily find countries where this share is almost 90%, meaning that we have to deal internationally with these really coming new challenges, food crisis. Prices are going to increase dramatically, and it's very obvious now. What we can do, we can just try to stop further increase. And this stop a further increase, meaning to have peace in Ukraine. To stop
Oleg Ustenko, economic advisor to President Zelensky, thank you very much.
Coming up on Global Business Europe, we'll have more on how the Ukraine war is affecting those food supplies around the world.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together.
My dad is Chinese, my mom is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It's only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Recovery teams are combing the wreckage of a China Eastern airliner in search of victims and the aircraft's black boxes.
The Boeing 737 crashed in the hills of Guangxi, southern China, on Monday, with 133 people on board. Brian Dorman has more.
A sleepless night, as hundreds of staff working round the clock try to salvage whatever they can. Now, they're focused on finding the aircraft's black box and other key objects, which could provide crucial evidence needed to understand what exactly happened to the Boeing 737. It's a difficult task, as pieces of wreckage scattered all across the mountainside are being carefully collected and processed. Drones are helping to support the operation too, and technical teams were quick to set up an emergency base.
The optical fiber has been laid in place. The base station has been opened at full power. It can basically meet the needs on the site, even if there are 1,500 people. We're also equipped with emergency phones here.
Satellites are providing assistance too. In such harsh terrain where more accidents are possible, a nearby hospital says it's ready for emergencies. Relief materials including water and food and emergency vehicles are arriving at the site. but it's proving a major logistical challenge.
Our roads are narrow, so cars can't get in. Carrying this search and rescue equipment and picking up volunteers is subject to coordination work. The most important thing is to carry these materials in, and motorcycles are more convenient for the work. Cars get stuck in these narrow roads. When the volunteers first started to get stuck in traffic, they carried these materials in by themselves. The tent was more than 80 kilograms, and they carried it for some distance.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered all-out efforts in search operations, while Vice Premier Liu He and State Councilor Wang Yang are in Guangxi to supervise. Boeing Chief Executive Dave Calhoun has offered the full support of the company's technical experts in the investigation. Leaders of many countries and international organizations have expressed their condolences. Brian Dorman, CGTN.
And investigators on the ground have been speaking to the media about the problems they've faced. Cao Chufeng has the latest from Wushu City in Guangxi.
Joining the press conference, there were an official from Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, a leader from Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region, Firefighters Bureau, a representative from China Eastern Airlines. And they start the press conference by giving us a general introduction of what the plane was like, how many passengers were on board, and also how's the rescue mission going so far. Let's hear it.
The crashed Boeing 737-800 plane went into service in June 2015 and has flown 18,000 hours. 123 Chinese passengers and 9 crew members were on board. So far, no survivors have been found in the search and rescue operation, and the Public Security Department has sealed off the impact zone.
Right now, a National Emergency Command Group have been formed, and they say there are 3 main purposes for this group. The first one is still searching for survivors, even though right now we haven't heard any good news in this area, but they are still searching. And the second one is to investigate possible causes behind this incident. And third is to provide comfort to relatives of the passengers. And right now, we still don't really know what has caused this incident. At the conference, the representative from China Eastern Airlines has said before this plane took off on 21st of March, everything was in working order. So they got the plane checked, and all the staff members on that plane were all healthy, and they have enough experience to be on that plane. The China Eastern Airlines is saying they will still investigate what happened. They will start a thorough investigation. Having said that, the command group is saying that the investigation is pretty hard because the plane is severely damaged, and they just started the investigation about yesterday, so they can't really give us more details about what happened, but they are hoping they will get the black box very soon, so they might know more about what happened that day.
A Russian court has sentenced Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny to 9 years in a maximum security penal colony.
The opposition leader, who's already serving a 3.5-year jail term for breaking bail conditions, was found guilty of large-scale fraud and contempt of court. He dismissed the case as politically motivated and had pleaded not guilty to the charges. Rights group Amnesty International has called the trial a sham.
Well, our correspondent Julia Chapman is in Moscow for us. There are limitations on what we can report, of course, from the Russian capital. Julia, can you give us any more details about the sentencing?
Well, this sentence comes on the back of 2 accusations against Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. The first was that he was embezzling funds, donations, into his anti-corruption foundation, which itself has now been closed after a court deemed it to be an extremist organization. The allegation was that Navalny stole $4.7 million from that organization, something that he has denied. The other accusation came on the back of a contempt of court charge relating to an alleged insult against a judge that Alexei Navalny had made. And together, the sentence was 9 years after the prosecutors called for 13 more years in jail for Alexei Navalny, who has himself been labeled a terrorist under Russian law. He had a pretty upbeat mood in court ahead of the verdict. He was making jokes during his final comments to the judge, and off the back of the verdict, he tweeted via his lawyers that he wanted his supporters to continue the fight against what he called the thieving and deceitful regime of Vladimir Putin. His supporters are certainly worried about his safety, with the world's attention turned to Ukraine. They say that he could be put in a higher security prison with less access to lawyers and family, and that even his life could now be in danger.
Julia, Russia's been hitting back at claims from the US that it's planning cyber attacks in response to Western sanctions.
That's right. The Kremlin has denied these accusations from the United States that are attempting to preempt any further Russian activity, saying that there could be cyber attacks against American companies and recommending that organizations bolster their cyber defenses. Today, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov insisted that that was not going to happen because he said, unlike other countries, including the US, Russia does not engage in banditry at the state level. So certainly a dismissal there. And indeed, Russian officials have been pointing to the fact that there has been an unprecedented number of cyber attacks against Russian government websites in recent weeks, which they insist they are equipped to handle. The Kremlin spokesperson also suggested in his daily chat with journalists that there was widespread support among the Russian people for the action in Ukraine, which the Kremlin insists we call a special military operation. But experts warn that it is very difficult to gauge the extent of public opinion under the circumstances. And Russian officials have also been dismissing this claim from the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that any outcome of peace negotiations between the two countries could be put to a referendum, with one Russian MP saying that Ukraine was simply dragging its feet.
Julia, thanks very much indeed. Julia Chapman there in Moscow for us.
French carmaker Renault has resumed production at its Moscow plants, despite many global brands suspending operations in Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. Renault said the decision to restart manufacturing has the backing of the French government, its main shareholder. Last month, the carmaker paused production due to logistical problems.
Tesla has officially opened its $5.5 billion gigafactory near Berlin, the electric car maker's first European hub. CEO Elon Musk was on hand to see 30 customers receive their Model Y cars, each costing over $70,000. Once at full capacity, the plant will produce 500,000 vehicles a year, with Musk calling it another step in the direction of a sustainable future.
China's e-commerce giant Alibaba Group is raising its share buyback to $25 billion, up from $15 billion. It's the group's biggest ever program to buy back its stock. Alibaba said it's already repurchased around $9.2 billion of its US-listed shares and plans to complete the program within the year. The US and UK trade officials are reportedly meeting to finalise a possible deal that would bring to an end Trump-era tariffs on British aluminium and steel. John Terrett joins us now from New York. Good to see you, John. What's the backstory here?
Hey, Juliet. Hey, Juliet and Andrew. Well, this is a very interesting story. I'm glad we're doing this one today. This story is linked to the Trump era, okay, and also Brexit. It gets a bit confusing in the middle, but if you remember, the UK used to have a trade deal with America, but it was under the auspices of being a European Union member, and then the UK came out of the European Union. And so ever since then, and a little bit before then, there's been a proposed new free trade deal between London and Washington on the table, but they're just talking about it, and they can't seem to move things forward. Now, in 2018, President Trump slapped 25% tariffs on UK steel imports coming into the United States, 10% on aluminium, or aluminum as the Americans call it, and he said it was a threat to national security at the time. Now, the UK retaliated, putting tariffs on iconic US companies such as Harley-Davidson. And this is where it gets a bit confusing, because the EU was doing this as well, but the EU's version of this dispute was resolved back in 2021, not the UK's. And indeed, The trade authorities in the UK were rather surprised when Biden came into the White House in January 2021 that he was rather cool about the idea of a free trade deal with the UK and kind of put it on the back burner, if you will, especially, I think, seen from London's point of view, that they think they have this special relationship between Washington and London going back to the days of the Second World War. But now enter someone called Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who is actually the International Trade Secretary. She's been there for a while now, and she says that there's been a change of heart, that things are moving now, that things are warmer on the idea of a free trade deal between Washington and London than they were before. Juliet?
So talk us through how those things are getting warmer. What are those signs of progress?
Well, the port of Baltimore is a huge port. It's about an hour's drive north of Washington, D.C., about 3 hours from New York, where I am. And it's one of about 3 or 4 on the East Coast. There's Portland, Maine, there's New York and New Jersey. There's this one, Baltimore, and then there's Norfolk, Virginia, further south. But Baltimore is huge, and they call it the gateway to Asia. And indeed, they've just stepped up their Asia imports through the Panama Canal, including China. So it's really, really big. And in Baltimore now, today and tomorrow, there is a conference on the future of Atlantic trade. And Anne-Marie Trevelyan is present along with Catherine Tai, who is President Biden's trade representatives. And Trevelyan says that Biden and his team, represented by Catherine Tai, are now sort of leaning in to the issue of a free trade deal with the UK. And it is also reported that the US may be about to announce in the next sort of 24, 48 hours that those tariffs imposed by Trump, 25% steel, 10% aluminum, may actually be about to be lifted, which would be an enormous, ending of the logjam that there seems to exist between the two capitals.
It sounds like Anne Trevelyan's in the right place at the right time. In terms of a free trade deal, when are we talking? Is this imminent?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Juliet, because actually it is reported that she was in D.C. last December and she said, I was basically kicking up a stink about this, saying, look, this is unacceptable. We've got to get this deal underway. She says it could take 12 to 18 months to finalise. I think you've got to remember that, as a government minister, as a secretary, she's actually got one eye on the future of the next election, which obviously is very understandable. It's also reported that the UK is coming up, or trying to come up, with mini trade deals with some of the states that they do a lot of trade with, including Indiana and the Carolinas and Oklahoma and places like that. And those little mini deals would sort of dovetail very nicely into the big one, which they hope will come eventually, and they will sort of smooth the way, that sort of thing. But to help you understand why this is all happening now, the answer is Ukraine. I mean, everything is Ukraine at the moment, isn't it? And it certainly is now. I think people are realizing the importance of historic ties like the one between London and Washington. And we do know that the Congress is on board now. They were a little bit hesitant a couple of years ago, but they're certainly on board now. And there are two reasons for that. One is that they recognize fully that the UK is a trusted long-term partner. And the other is that, seen from the Congress perspective, if you have a country like the UK seeking a trade deal, then it's probably better to go for that in these times of conflict, when many countries in the West are lining up to be very much anti-Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine. So it looks as if the Ukraine has rather focused minds, Juliet. Shall we put it that way?
Very much so. So focused mind in times of conflict and times of inflation. John Terrett in New York, thank you.
Indeed, yeah.
Still ahead on Global Business Europe, the UN says the war's forced 3.5 million people from Ukraine. We'll be reporting from the Polish border town where thousands of them are now staying.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Andrew Wilson and me, Juliet Mann. The headlines again. Ukraine's President Zelensky says his country can survive the attacks by Russia, but warns the conflict will have a global impact.
Streets of Kiev are quiet as the capital remains under curfew. Ukrainian forces, however, claim they've retaken a key suburb.
As recovery teams search the site of a plane crash in southern China, questions continue to be asked over why it came down so quickly.
Lebanon has been grappling with an economic crisis for the last 3 years, throwing large numbers of people into poverty.
Now its economic woes are being made worse by Russia's attack on Ukraine. Priyanka Navani reports from the district of Akkar in the north of the country.
For Fatima, it's been a grueling couple years. Her husband died 2 years ago, leaving her to raise her 5 children alone during Lebanon's devastating economic crisis.
Gas is expensive. We don't have generator fuel. No wood, we can't get warm. We can't eat meat or bring chicken. Even tomatoes cost so much. I'm barely affording bread. I don't have anyone to help me.
Food costs have risen over 1,000% since 2019. But now, as Lebanon imports 90% of its cooking oil and wheat from Ukraine and Russia, the situation has only gotten worse.
There's no oil. There is nothing. It's not only expensive, but it's unavailable. The situation is so bad.
Hala Irani, the founder of NGO Saeed to Saad, has been helping families like Fatima's weather the crisis. Irani is frustrated that the government, which has long faced allegations of mismanagement, has allowed the situation to get this bad.
Poverty does not exist in vacuum. Poverty is the result of injustice. These people did not just wake up and found themselves poor. It's the result of the corruption of this government that has neglected this region for such a long time.
Similarly, she says it's not solely the Ukraine crisis that has contributed to the unavailability and the rise in price of cooking oil and wheat.
There is like a joke that in Lebanon they are circulating now. I hope the Lebanese suppliers don't think that the dates come from Ukraine, so they don't raise their prices.
As the local currency continues to decline, subsidies on several basic goods have been gradually lifted over the years. For some merchants, they've made a business of hoarding goods to then sell them at a higher rate. Mazen, a local shopkeeper, says that's now happening with wheat and oil.
The greed of the big merchants is playing a big role here. The issue is 50% about Ukraine and 50% price gouging. In this crisis, you see merchants storing all the oil and waiting for the price to go up so they can sell it at a higher price.
Remote parts of Lebanon lay bare the wounds of a nation. The government has long since forgot about these areas, and aid groups, as hard as they try, simply cannot fill in all of the gaps. It's a situation so fragile that a war happening thousands of miles away can cause Lebanese to go hungry and render them more vulnerable than they ever thought possible. Priyanka Navani, CGTN, Akkar.
Ukraine and Russia provide almost a third of the world's wheat, so the war there risks driving up prices, of course, around the world. Developing nations are likely to be hardest hit, increasing the risk of famine. Hanna Saarinen is EU Food Policy Advisor for Oxfam International. She joins me now from Brussels. Hanna, thanks very much indeed for joining us. That little snapshot of Lebanon is just one example of the many layers of this problem. We've got the pandemic, of course, as well. Is it the case that the war in Ukraine is just another kick to an already really delicate food system?
Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, the situation is as you described. Already before, the food systems across the globe were in a fragile situation. There were several hunger hotspots across the world. Globally, there are more than 800 million people suffering from food insecurity. Out of those, more than 160 million people are in acute hunger. The crisis in Ukraine is indeed coming on top of the existing vulnerabilities and the existing humanitarian crisis. There are several hunger hotspots, for example, in the East African region and in the Middle East, who are highly dependent on wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia. And the crisis is going to be yet another hit on these fragile situations.
Whenever we talk about Russia and Ukraine, we talk about cooking oil and wheat particularly. Is this principally about wheat and oil? Are these 2 or 3 ingredients the key to feeding the planet?
They are among the key food commodities. Wheat is important in this case because Ukraine and Russia are such big players in the wheat export markets, especially towards the low-income countries. So Ukraine holds a share of about 10%. It is the third largest exporter of wheat globally, Russia being the largest. What's important to note is that there are several low-income countries that are directly dependent on the wheat imports from these two countries on their food security. So there are 14 low-income countries who actually directly depend on their food security on the wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia.
I mean, we know that Egypt, for example, gets almost all its wheat, even though it has a local harvest itself, but pretty much all its wheat from Ukraine, so we'll be directly affected. But is there no way the planet or the world economies can adjust, find these crops elsewhere, farm them elsewhere, change things around, or are we completely at the mercy of the existing geography?
What we are facing, it's more a political failure. So, in fact, the world is producing enough food for everybody already as of today. And even without the imports from Ukraine and Russia, there would be other ways to feed the people. So the problem, it is really a political failure. There are several shocks that the food system has faced. The COVID pandemic was one. This Ukraine crisis is coming on top. But these external shocks, they are actually just highlighting how fragile the current food system is and how much these hunger hotspots are relying for their food security on a fragile system. So there is actually a very high need to choose the transition towards more resilient food systems, both in terms of social resilience as well as environmental resilience. And actually the food systems should be transformed so that people's food security would be more reliant on local food systems, not on the global systems that is so vulnerable and is currently, for example, in a lot of turmoil.
I mean, it's long been said that famine is a political crime rather than a crime of food supply per se. But is there not some way, when we have catastrophes like this, why is the politics so hard? Is there not some way that a united effort on the part of different governments, on different organizations around the world, can break the blockages in this food supply chain?
So there is a need for more political will. Right now, here in the immediate term, there is a need to respond to the humanitarian crisis and provide food assistance for the people in need. But looking at the longer term, we do need to transform the food system and ensure that it is more resilient against these shocks. And from where that starts, it could be based on more local production, based on smallholder production, family farming, go back to the basics and choose to build resilience from the local communities.
Hannes Arnen, thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN Europe. Still to come, why some bars and restaurants in New York are being hurt by the war in Ukraine.
This is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Friends here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the within front clear line. view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. More than 3.5 million people have now fled Ukraine, with most of them crossing the border into Poland.
The Polish city of Lublin is now one of the largest humanitarian hubs in the EU. Some 1,000 volunteers have gathered there to help the arriving refugees. Natalie Carney reports.
The population of Lublin has increased around 15% since February 24th. 40 to 50,000 Ukrainian refugees have found temporary sanctuary here, where the civic community to support Ukraine was established within hours of the conflict beginning. Lublin has become a bit of a role model in integration, according to the head of international affairs for the city.
The committee, this is 17 subcommittees, dealing with housing, dealing with educational issue, with the legal advice, with the medicine, taking care of children, and so on, so on. More than 1,200 volunteers. And once again, this is the joint effort of the inhabitants, NGOs, and City Hall.
Yet Lublin is not only supporting those arriving, but also those still trapped in Ukraine by the shelling. One of the largest logistics networks for humanitarian aid is located here. The volunteer initiative Help Ukraine Center ensures the fastest collection and dispatch of humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
Every day we send 170 tons. It's approximately 15 to 17 trucks. That's what leaves here every day.
Donations from all over Europe are sorted by volunteers from all over the world, such as Jonathan. He took time off from his job in the U.S. to fly out and help with the aid effort in Poland.
I just wanted to help any way I could. I sent an email online to volunteer for Ukraine. They hooked me up with a spot, and I just flew over. Anybody who can help should, and I'm able to help, so that's why I'm here.
The conflict forced Russian volunteer Ivan to flee his Kyiv home along with his Ukrainian wife. His family back in Russia believe the Kremlin's narrative, which has led Ivan to cut all ties with them.
I couldn't just sit, and check the news. I decided to come here and help people, help my family, because now almost all my family in Ukraine, and they need our help. They need food, they need clothes, they need everything. And that's why I'm here.
Once organized, the goods are loaded onto trucks and driven into the conflict zone, leaving the warehouse ready to accept more.
An empty warehouse is a great sign for those facilitating the hundreds of tons of aid going to Ukraine. However, reports are emerging of full warehouses on the other side of the border as heavy challenges remain just getting that aid to the people most in need.
Once in Ukraine, the goods must be assessed to establish where in the country they are most needed. And then the conflict itself presents enormous challenges for the deliveries.
We are facing the most unhuman war ever. We're trying our best to deliver, food, water, diapers, and medication to the places where it's needed, but sometimes it's hard to manage. And sometimes our, goods are attacked by Russians because they're also starving.
The need for support in Ukraine is unprecedented, but those who have made it out are also in desperate need.
We expect the serious assistance, first of all to Ukraine, but also to those communities which assist those who are forced to escape.
Natalie Carney for CGTN, Lublin, Poland.
And as millions of refugees flee the violence in Ukraine, observers say there's a growing and urgent need for psychological support alongside immediate priorities of food and shelter. Our correspondent Mia Alberti has been meeting volunteers on the front line of trauma treatment in Hungary, just across the Ukrainian border.
Vitaly arrived from Ukraine just a few hours ago. He's showing me why he left. This was the view from his window just a few days ago. It took 5 days for Vitaly, his wife, and their 12-year-old daughter to travel from Chernihiv in northern Ukraine to safety in Hungary. The memories of what they've lived through are still fresh.
You cannot imagine how scary it is to live on the 5th floor and see helicopters coming in your direction, shooting and seeing everything on fire.
Now they found safety at this emergency center on the Hungarian border. Here, away from the war, refugees face another, more silent battle: trauma. This therapist, who has asked to remain anonymous, is one of many volunteers joining this front line.
Many of them want to speak about what they went through, what they left there, who they left there. But many of them really don't. Today that someone started to speak about it, the story was seriously horrible, and then in the middle of the story, I didn't ask, they started to speak about it, and in the middle of the story she said that, okay, she don't want to speak about it anymore, she don't want to speak to me anymore. It happens.
Trauma experts say Ukrainian refugees will be vulnerable to developing lifelong emotional distress. Overcoming the horrors of war is especially hard for those who left someone behind.
There are very horrible stories. Obviously, this is a war. Obviously, I am the one who's listening to the stories. I hear things that I never heard and I never imagined. Obviously, yes. But those things are mostly done. Horrible things, but they are done. These people will stand up again, build a life again, not forget it, but get over it, most likely. But what they cannot get over, and that could be just so horrible, who they left there to die, because they are many times using this term, actually.
Most children are okay, but there are exceptions. This therapist recalls the story of a 4-year-old who, after days in a bunker while his house was bombed, developed a fear of confined spaces. For the most severe cases, she has found a simple way to help.
And it works. It works.
It's a universal language to decodify what are very complex and difficult memories. All of the refugees here have different tales to tell. Some of them still too hard to remember, others impossible to forget. Ina is a psychologist herself and is well aware of what faces her family.
So far we haven't thought about that. We just think of surviving the day. My daughter will be feeling the effects for sure, but no one can tell when or how.
Do you think it will also affect you?
Yes, it will also affect me. It's never going to be the same.
Most of Ina's family stayed in Ukraine. This will be her first night of sleep in days. No more bombs or helicopters, but still on her mind, the constant concern for those that stayed behind. Mia Alberti, CGTN, in Berekshurani, on the Hungarian border with Ukraine.
New York is home to a number of Russian bars and restaurants. Many have expressed opposition to Russia's actions in Ukraine, but they're still experiencing a backlash from customers, as Karina Huber reports.
The Russian Samovar, a restaurant serving Russian food, has been a New York institution for decades. But its future looks less certain as the conflict in Ukraine is disrupting business.
Since day one of the war, we started receiving hate mail. We started getting phone calls calling us Nazis, fascists, our restaurant should burn.
Von Schatz says bookings have plummeted and she's lost 60% of her business. This after struggling to survive through the pandemic.
I feel like they're trying to cancel our restaurant because it has the word Russian in front of it.
The nearby Russian vodka room is experiencing the same thing.
We're getting slow because people are scared to support Russians, but we're not a Russian company. We're an American company who just have a name of Russian vodka room.
Russian and even some Ukrainian restaurants in New York have learned that anything linking them to Russia can be bad for business. Sveta, a restaurant owned by Ukrainians, used to market its food as Russian because it's more familiar to New Yorkers and a very similar type of cuisine. But after receiving a barrage of negative emails, the restaurant changed its online marketing. It now calls its food modern European. Many Russian restaurants, including the world-famous Russian Tea Room, have criticized Russia's actions in Ukraine. In a statement, the Russian Tea Room said it renounces Russia's unprovoked acts of war in the strongest possible terms. Russian Samovar has expressed support for Ukraine and launched a fundraiser to help Ukrainians. Von Schatz, who is Russian, is married to a Ukrainian, and much of her staff is Ukrainian. She says what's happening is a deeply personal tragedy.
We speak to people in Ukraine on a daily basis. We get videos. We are watching the news every day. This whole situation is horrific. We are very much against the war, any war, but especially this war.
Russia hasn't commented on what is happening to New York City's Russian restaurants, but Russia says by imposing sanctions against Russian businesses, the U.S. has declared economic war against Russia. Karina Huber, CGTN, New York.
Karina Huber there with just another example of the collateral damage that's been affected by this war in Ukraine around the world. You're watching CGTN. These are our headlines again. Ukraine's President Zelensky says his country can survive the attacks by Russia, but he has warned, speaking to the Italian parliament, that the conflict will have a global impact.
The streets of Kiev are quiet as the capital remains under curfew. Ukrainian forces claim they've retaken a key suburb.
And as our reporters on the ground have been telling us, recovery teams are still searching the site of the plane crash in southern China. Questions continue to be asked, though, over why it came down so quickly.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.